Hey everybody, John here with our second edition of the weekly business micro trainings. In the month of September, we're going over recruiting. Last week we talked about asking. The answer to the unasked question is always no. This week we're going to dive into the impact of assumptions. The reality is every time you walk into any situation, you're always going to be making some form of an assumption. It's really how we evaluate the world based on what we see and the knowledge that we know given the situation. And so we have the ability to alter the assumptions that we make, because the assumptions that you make will alter the interaction that you have. It's going to change how you respond, and it's going to change how they respond. And it might seem small, but changing the assumptions that you make can make a huge impact. So really just diving right into it, I'm going to first talk about negative assumptions you can make, and then we'll talk about some positive assumptions that you can make that can alter and change the way you interact with folks. All right, so number one, the negative assumptions that you can make are either one, you can make an assumption, you can make a negative assumption about their attitude or their emotion, especially towards you. The second one is assuming their response for them. So number one, assuming I've got my notes here to make sure I got it. So number one, assuming their attitude or emotion. This is where you make an assumption about how they view or feel about you. Some people, especially online, are not the best communicators, very straightforward, dry, or lack tact, or even just ask a ton of questions. In home parties, you might even get somebody who's giving you daggers. Their facial expression is just a straight, glaring face. But and we may see these things, and we may think, you know what, that person does not like me, or they are not about this. There's no way I'm going to ask them if they want to book a party or become a freedom fighter, because I know they don't want to. Right? That's the assumption that we make. The reality is the truth is generally the farthest from that. It's just because of how people communicate, or how people take in information, or how people look as they're evaluating what you're saying, especially for in-home parties. And so you have to recognize that. The second assumption is assuming their response for them. Ultimately, this is the worst assumption you could possibly make. Because the reality is also that this is the assumption that most people are going to make throughout their lifetime. It's going to be the biggest struggle, is we're going to answer for other people in what we do. Now, the problem with answering for other people is it's wildly undignified. It's somebody coming to you and saying, you know what, I know what you're thinking, I know what you're going to say, and I'm not even going to let you have a say in what the answer is. When we assume, hey, you don't want to become a freedom fighter, you're just too busy. Hey, you don't want to become a freedom fighter, you don't like the product. Hey, you didn't order, so you must not want to become a freedom fighter. Whatever it is, whatever that response we make, we're going to justify us saying not asking by giving that answer for them. We're going to make that justification for whatever reason, and say, you know what, I'm not going to ask because their answer is no. But what that means is you didn't give that person a chance to speak for themselves. And if it was turned around and flipped around, how would we feel if somebody made that kind of assumption for us? Again, this one's really hard because it's very, very, very common, but it's also very undignified. And we are about the dignity business. So one thing that's also to realize is that the impact of these goes well beyond these initial things, because when we hold these assumptions, it's going to change the way that we interact with them, and it's going to be really hard to make a good relationship with them because we've made these negative assumptions, and it's also going to change how they interact with us because they're going to feel and feed off that negativity. I'm going a little bit long today, sorry. So positive assumption. Assume they are interested, right? This is called, in the selling world, this is called assumptive selling. You walk into a situation and you assume, you know what, this person has to have some level of interest, and I'm going to see if we can pique that curiosity with asking them about the opportunity. Now, one thing to keep in mind is an assumption and a hope are not the same thing, so do not put your hopes in this. You still are looking for an answer. Maybe there is some level of interest, but nowhere near enough that they would say yes. Who knows? You don't, but you want to assume that there is some level of interest, so your asking is just kind of reaching out towards that and seeing if that level of interest is enough for them or not. They get to make that decision. You're just assuming that there's some form of interest. The second positive assumption is assuming the best. really, this is anytime you communicate with somebody, understand that you do not know their life, you don't know what's going on in their life, what their struggles are, and you have to really just assume the best in the situation, especially if they're not communicating with you or they're really short with you. Assume that there's other things going on that are affecting that situation or affecting why they're acting in the way that they are acting. Realize that this is what you would want for you when interacting with others, right? You want somebody else to assume the best of you if you're in a situation where maybe you're not being the best communicator there. This is a great way to show dignity. So really, that's kind of in closing here. Just recognize that assumptions will always happen, but you get to decide whether you choose to have a negative or a positive. It's going to be a lifelong struggle, I promise you, but are you continually working towards that? And then really a takeaway here that I would have for you is what is a negative? So put this in the comments. What is a negative assumption that you've been making that you want to stop? And what's a positive assumption that you're going to start doing? Because if you're going to take something away, you need to add it in. Otherwise, that negative thing, that thing you're taking away, which was a habit, will eventually come back anyway. So you have to replace, if you take away something negative, you have to replace it with something positive. So let me let that know in the comments. Next week, we're going to be talking about hosting a great party, because that is one of the most effective tools in recruiting, is hosting a party that somebody else would want to do for themselves. So we'll talk about that next week.